Welcome to Seek Justice, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the nuances of criminal justice. Good morning, Dennis.
Good morning, Eric. How are you?
Doing well. Today, as we had scheduled on the program, we are going to be talking about the criminal justice reform policies put forth by presidential candidate Joe Biden. And Joe is a much trickier candidate to evaluate in this aspect because he has a long history of messing with the criminal justice system. Most notably, I think, probably is the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which he wrote and then got passed, signed into law by Bill Clinton, which caused a lot of our current problems. And so because of the current political climate, he's obliged now, if he wants to try to be president, to walk all of that back, whether or not he has actually changed his mind on things. So, do you remember what the debate was around that at the time, and after it got passed, what the consequences were?
Well, so this is what happens when you've got a record that goes back some 30 years. Unlike most of the other candidates, except for Elizabeth Warren, who never did anything like this, or Bernie Sanders, who never did anything like this. But back in 1994, when that act was being debated, it did have support of the Black Caucus in the Congress in its original form. But because the negotiations went back and forth, it ended up becoming quite onerous. Three-strikes-you're-out legislation absolutely created the rampant escalation of the size of America's prison populations and the federal population, and just very tough on crime. And, on the one hand, it's good to see that he is now saying, and he's been clear on this, that you can find the notes where he was in South Carolina, and he said it was a mistake. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a positive thing. But at the same time, you've got a lot of candidates out there who haven't made such mistakes, who rallied against these types of things forever. And so you're looking at I think, a kind of a damaged candidate in Joe Biden when it comes to this justice reform.
Mm-hmm. You have to have some respect for people that are willing to say that they made a mistake, because Lord knows President Trump would never admit to having ever made a mistake. But on the other hand, you are still guilty of what you have apologized for, but still.
Well, and it's not like, I'm sorry. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of lives that have been affected. People have died because of this. I mean, it's like, well, forgive me for, someone would say, forgive me for supporting, the Vietnam War. It's, right. Okay. There's a lot of water gone under that bridge, but to his credit, I think he's on the right track here. It's similar to Bernie's plan, and that we've reviewed already, in some way that it promises a lot of stuff and is pretty adamant about what it will do, without giving a lot of detail and not particularly tackling how it's going to be done. Unlike Bernie's original version, which I think has improved some, and more like Elizabeth Warren's, it's got some citations to it. I've looked at some of those. They track back to various reports and whatnot, and so it's got some evidence basis to it, but a lot of that evidence doesn't point to exactly what he's going to do and how he's going to do it. Like both of the other two candidates we reviewed, he's going to throw an awful lot of money at it, and with his other promises that he's made around improvement in healthcare and improvement in education, which doesn't go nearly as far as some of the other candidates, is still very expensive. And so as we jump into it, we can kind of keep those things in mind.
It's good to see candidates looking more at preventative, stopping the root cause of crime to lower crime, rather than just being punitive. Like I think he's got something in here about PreK Education, providing that to everybody and stuff like that. And his is the only one we've seen that has a YouTube video at the top for people that only want to listen to 90 seconds of his. I listened to it. It's not particularly impressive. No,
I think he filmed it in Detroit. It seems kind of slapped together, frankly. and he's kind of got this Bernie-esque voice over.
There is a little Bernie.
He's giving a speech, obviously, so he's espousing anger, and it's like, Joe, who are you mad at?
Right.
You're mad at yourself for doing all this.
Mad at 1990s Joe. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, let's jump in here. He starts, as others do, with opening statements, which are hard to find fault in, and talks about the over-incarceration of persons of color, et cetera, and people being detained and locked up because of their poverty. And he says, principles. He's got several core principles. No one should be incarcerated for drug use alone. Instead, they should be diverted to drug courts and treatment. Reducing the number of incarcerated individuals will reduce federal spending on incarceration. And I'm not, this is an important word here.
Federal.
And it kind of sticks out because he's not talking about, he didn't say no one should be incarcerated in the federal system for drug use alone, or instead they should be diverted to federal drug court and federal treatment. Here, he seems to be parsing this to focus on federal spending. We'll see how that plays out, and then he wants to reinvest that savings in communities. Well, if that's his beginning point, this is his very first principle. Mm-hmm. Well, here's the thing. You're not going to save any money anytime soon by changing policies.
Right.
The size of the federal system and the size of the state systems are written into stone for a while. And until we go through an entire several years of massive reforms, would you see reduced spending? Because most spending, as we've talked about in the podcast, is rooted in the cost of prisons and the cost of correctional officers and staff. Right. You're not going to change that. So if he's going to wait for those savings, that's going to happen long after he's after his first term. And you're talking about a guy, how old is Joe? 76 or, it's like, man, you're going to be somewhere in your 80s in your second term. And I don't know. Anyway, that's just my first cut on that. He says our justice system can't be just unless we root out the racial, gender, and income disparities of the system. All right.
You're right, yeah.
Very value laden here. Black mothers and fathers should feel confident their children are safe walking the streets, and, women and children are uniquely impacted in the system. Okay, the system impacts them, and these are values, so it's like, so what are you going to do about it? Mm-hmm. He wants to be focused on redemption and rehabilitation, and nobody should be profiteering off our justice system. Okay, so those are good values, and then he gets into the depth of it. Here's a smart thing he does. He latches on to Congressman Bobby Scott's Safe Justice Act. Mm-hmm. And Bobby Scott has been a hero of this work for a very long time. And this Safe Justice Act is something that has been put together with some realistic expectations of what can happen in the House and then what can happen in the Senate. Not so realistic about its value to be passed by the Senate. If it had been, it would have been there by now, and it hasn't been.
Mm-hmm. SAFE being an acronym for safe. You got acronyms where the first word is the first letter stands for the name of the acronym. Is kind of trouble, but Safe, Accountable, Fair, Effective Justice Act. So that will be linked in the show notes.
Yeah. So he wants to take bold action to reduce our prison population and create a more just society and make our communities safer by, big stuff, preventing crime and providing opportunities for all, eliminating racial disparities, eliminating them, and ensuring fair sentences, offering second chances, reducing violence in communities. Okay, that's a bunch of big promises. He's not couching his terms. Mm-hmm. I think Elizabeth Warren's were more realistic in terms of what she wants to fight for, what she wants to push for, right. Where here he's just making these bold statements. And frankly, I don't believe he's going to get these things done.
Right.
He can try, he can work at it, but his language is like, tone it down, man. So preventing crime and providing opportunities. It's got some facts, links to those facts. Girls in the justice system with physical or sexual abuse as high as 80 or 90%, an excellent point to begin with. The school to prison pipeline where 1 out of every 4 kids in foster care will interact with the justice system. Good stuff. Right. Linking it to lower literacy levels, very good. And too many people with mental health or substance abuse disorders end up incarcerated. And he wants to address these underlying factors. And he gets into more research, the costs, the true cost, emotional and financial, on families. This is good research he does here. So I like this.
Yep.
And then he starts right out with the very first thing. He's going to create a $20 billion competitive grant program to spur states to shift from incarceration and prevention. So good that he acknowledges that it's got to happen at the state and the local level,
and how the federal government can, put their crowbar into moving the heavy rocks of the states. But yes.
Yep. And another smart thing he does here, that he links to a proposal by another group that's got good credibility, that isn't responsible for the 1994 Act, the Brennan Center, which is a very good think tank on these things, and he connects to that. And so,
although I also read that competitive grant programs was also how he got the states to build more prisons back in the 90s. Like he incentivized them to.
Well,
that is the tool, the crowbar, like I just said, of how you can move policy in the states from the federal. So
well, and it is a good proposal. I'd like to see how they're going to fund it, how they're going to pay for it, and also what are the parameters of it. I mean, you've got currently federal competitive programs funded through the Second Chance Act that are not $20 billion by any stretch of the imagination, but several $100 million anyway. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they've been particularly effective at shifting things, and there's research that shows that. I mean,
interesting.
It's one thing to create an opportunity to plan how to get these things done, and then, as we've discussed endlessly, another matter altogether to implement effective policies that are actually going to change the nature of the system and sustain those changes. And so a lot of details need to come up here. I haven't fully reviewed the Brennan Center proposal, so I can get into that a little bit at another time. Okay. And then, as you mentioned, I mean, he links to some other stuff in his educational, his called Plan for Educators, Students, and Our Future, and makes the point, which is a good one, that if you improve education, you should improve longer-term outcomes in the justice system. That's true.
Right. He wants to make PreK available to every 3 and 4 year old.
And that's smart,
for sure.
So how long is it going to be before we see those results, and how long does the federal government, the state government have to sustain that? They're 3 years old now.
15 years, then when they're 18.
Keep them out at 15, and then after that in their 20s. I mean, it's long-term stuff which you have to support. You want to criticize it.
Exactly.
But at the same time, he's talking about investing the savings, and frankly, that's not a very accurate way to think about it. He's going to spend a pile of more money while he's already spending money, and that's realistic. But he doesn't say that, and it's kind of a hoodwink, frankly.
Because that's a hard truth that voters don't want to hear. That they don't want to hear you're going to spend more money, and then maybe we'll see the improvement in 20 years.
I mean, how would it read if he said, "Look, I'm going to tax you more, and you're going to pay a lot more in taxes, and as a result of that, we're going to just continue, for the most part, the system the way that it is. We'll try to make some inroads, but you're going to be spending a lot of money on that system, which will continue. Then you're going to spend even more money on this, and we're going to hope it works." Right. Even though research shows that most implementation efforts don't stick. I don't think somebody's going to put that in their campaign.
And then by 2040, there's going to be lower crime.
Yeah, when he's like 115 years old. So anyway, he then, as all the candidates we've looked at so far, I wouldn't be surprised if every single candidate does this, to expand funding for mental health and substance use disorder, both services and research. And he wants to expand health insurance coverage, and so that helps with that. And he wants to double the number of psychologists, guidance counselors, nurses, et cetera, in the schools, so kids get what they need.
Again, that's not a federal thing.
That's good stuff, but I'm not. Yeah, and I'm not quite sure about the long-term link of that. I think would be clearer. The short-term link on that, not so much. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't really, in this bullet here, doesn't really talk about specifically how that's going to affect the justice system. Doesn't talk about what he's going to do in the prisons. Doesn't talk about what he's going to do in jail. Doesn't mention, as he should and as we do, the fact that you've got better mental health systems inside county level, parish level jails than you do in the community. So judges are will tell you they're sentencing people into jails for treatment that they otherwise won't get. Now what he's talking about here can get at that, but you're talking about passing healthcare reform that's going to take years, and in the meantime, what do you do? So good, but again, I'm not quite sure the connection or how it's going to happen. Get people who should be supported with social services instead of in our prisons, connected to the help they need. A very grammatically clumsy sentence to begin with. And good, and smart. And he's got a lot of statement here that's true about the challenge here. And he doesn't say how he's going to do it. He wants to change the nature of the interactions. The Biden administration will fund initiatives to partner mental health and substance use disorder experts, social worker, and disability advocates with police departments. All right, well, that's a good start, but that's not where it's just doesn't stop there. It's every point of the justice system. It's jails, it's pretrial detention. It's particularly meaningful for courts to have access to these types of programs, and then in the jails and in the prisons post-release and whatnot. And so, this suffers. This particular bullet suffers from a lack of specificity. And then he just leaves it. And it seems oriented almost completely to working with the police, which is short-sighted. Mm-hmm. Next whole section about eliminating racial disparities, not reducing them, but eliminating them.
Yeah, again, that's extreme verbiage that Bernie used, as opposed to Warren's more, we're going to reduce this by 20% or whatever.
It's fight to get it done, and so he starts out with something he does have some authority over, which is expanding the use and the power of the Department of Justice to address systemic misconduct in police departments and prosecutors' offices, which is true. And he can do that to try to restore trust between police and communities. And he goes into quite a bit of information about just that. And the heading here is eliminating racial disparities and ensuring fairer sentences. So simply, it's a big deal, but simply looking at systemic misconduct in police departments and prosecutors doesn't get you there. It's a good start. If it's comprehensive, it's going to take more at each step of the justice system. It's not particularly comprehensive.
Yeah.
Now, he goes on. I mean, it's not the limit of it, but the first thing that comes to mind is it's not comprehensive. He wants to establish an independent task force on prosecutorial discretion, and says that they'll make recommendations, and then so what? Okay, and then what? You're going to fight in Congress? What are you going to do, Joe?
Yeah.
He wants to invest in public defenders' offices and makes smart statements there about that people have to have quality representation, and there's a wage disparity. He wants to expand
between the prosecutors and defenders.
Yeah.
Where?
Or our law firm and being a public defender. Okay. Now, you can wager, something about that. You can work at that, but you're not going to end that disparity.
Sure.
It's too great. And he wants to expand resources. He links back to Obama-Biden effort. We'd have to take a look at that and see.
He does that in several places, and I think it's good psychology on his part to drop in the term Obama-Biden administration whenever he can, because anytime he can put a name that has a positive connotation next to his is clever.
Yeah. It's funny he doesn't do that about immigration and deportation, for example, right? I mean, this is the thing that he was attacked on during the last debate when he was kind of distancing himself from that and said, well, he was only vice president, and I think it was Castro who came back and said, yeah, well, when it suits you. Right. And you can't blame him, but Sure. So anyway, here's something a little bit more realistic, and it kind of stands out because it's parsed particularly interestingly. He wants to eliminate mandatory minimums, but then he says he supports an end to it, and as president, he'll work for the passage of legislation to repeal them at the federal level, and he'll give states incentives to repeal their mandatory minimums. I guess that goes back to the $20 billion fund he has, but here he's careful.
Isn't that interesting?
A little bit more
isn't
careful.
it interesting how it sort of slides down the spectrum from Bernie to Warren, where he's like, we're going to eliminate this, and then but really we're just going to support it, and then we're going to try and work to pass it, and maybe it'll get done.
And we'll give some states
the confidence level just sort of droops in that whole paragraph.
Yeah. Ending the disparity between federal crack at the federal level between crack and powder cocaine punishments. Good.
I heard that's
goes back to what
I heard that's 100 to 1 is the ratio there. Like you get the same sentence for 1 gram of crack as you do for 100 grams of cocaine. That's pretty.
I think originally, as you know, the Mark Maurer at the Sentencing Project did a lot of work nationally to
minimize,
reduce that already, and that's why he says here, end once and for all.
Right.
The work that Sentencing Project did didn't totally eliminate the disparity, but it moved in that direction. And then he proposed stuff in 2007. All right, it was proposed, so why didn't it get through? Why didn't it pass? And if it didn't pass then, why is it going to pass now? What did you do with that when you were vice president in the Obama-Biden administration? I mean, you got a guy with a record like this, and he leaves himself open to all sorts of these kinds of issues. Now, he wants to decriminalize the use of cannabis and automatically expunge all prior cannabis use convictions. Well, he doesn't say anything here. He starts out by saying, no one should be in jail because of cannabis use, and he wants to decriminalize it. He'll support the use of legalization for medical purposes, but then leave the rest up to the states. See, so here he is really
he backs off that bullet point really quickly.
He backs way off. Well, he wants to decriminalize the use. He doesn't want to legalize it. It's very different. It's one thing to say it's legal and anybody can have it, and it's another thing to say, well, if you have it, we're not going to send you to jail for it. There's just a big distinction there, and this is raised by. Okay. You can find some articles about this, how it parses this down to much different than Biden and Evans.
Okay, I'll find some article about legalization versus decriminalization and put it in the show notes at seekjustice.fm/022.
Wants to end all incarceration for drug use, all of it, and instead divert individuals to drug courts and treatment. So
isn't that like a superset of the previous bullet point?
Yeah. He's
what?
He's a little redundant here, but here Biden will require federal courts to divert these individuals to drug courts, and then he'll incentivize states, and he'll expand federal funding. Well, so a couple of things here, and there's no.
Again, this is all stuff you have to get through Congress, right? Through the Republican Congress.
Got to get it through Congress, unless the Senate changes. It's going to be a Republican Senate. At the state level, it's even worse, tougher.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is, there's no citations here at all. And here's the thing about these diversion programs is that they're not necessarily being used for people who otherwise would go to prison or jail. They're used for people who probably wouldn't have gone in the first place. It's a rampant criticism of these so-called diversion programs. And I think we've talked about this before in other podcasts, as we will again, but it's you put out this language that too many people are going to prison for drugs, et cetera. Then you put up an opportunity, and the judge says, "All right, well you're here for the first time or the second time in front of me, and so I'm going to divert you and put you in this program." Well, does the number of people going to prison go down? Does the incarceration rate decrease? These are simple tests to see whether or not they're actually diverting people. In most cases, they're not. Not to argue that they're not positive for people. They are. Not to argue that if you get at these issues a little earlier in their drug use career, that you can change the trajectory of their future imprisonment. But if that's what you're doing, then say it. Don't say that you're ending incarceration and then you put forth a standard that says this is for first-time nonviolent offenders, which is often the case, nonviolent offenders or early in their criminal activity. So. This doesn't change. This doesn't meet the smell test to me. Not a terrible thing, but just doesn't really. It's not particularly realistic. Wants to expand other effective alternatives to detention. He's linking to some alternative detention courts, veteran courts, youthful offender courts, and the same criticism I levied a moment ago. I would levy here as well. Wants to eliminate the death penalty. Now here he parses his words. Biden will work to pass legislation to eliminate the death penalty at the federal level, incentivize states to follow the federal government's example. So if he doesn't get it done at the federal level, does that mean he's not going to have an example to use at the state level? You know, I just don't see how this is going to happen. And incentivizing, I don't know. That's got to be an awful lot of money. Use the president's clemency power to secure the release of individuals facing unduly long sentences. Then he talks about Obama, that he used clemency more than any of the 10 prior presidents and continue that tradition. All right, well, so I don't know how many that is. We could take a look at those numbers, but you're not going to eliminate mass incarceration through clemency. No. Yeah. Then he goes into a series of things to end the criminalization of poverty, end cash bail.
Which is a thing we've seen from the other
candidates.
He
will lead a national effort. Yeah, they talk about this, not this way. He'll lead a national effort. And how does he do that? Where does that take place? Where is that more incentivization? Is that more dangling money? I mean, how far does $20 billion go when it comes to all of these incentives?
Right.
You know, it's good what he writes here about the facts. I mean, again, this is every candidate's done this. They've got it down as to what the problems are.
Which is what we've been saying for months now, of we don't need more research. We know what the problems are. We need action, but yeah.
So here, for stopping jailing people for being too poor, he uses grant-making power of the federal government to incentivize the end of policies that incarcerate people for failing to pay fines and fees. All right, well, we'll see what that does in a handful of states that successfully compete. And then in the ones that get the funding, the ones that do it in a sustainable way, I'm not quite sure that that's the way that happens. He talks about states. He doesn't talk about governors. He doesn't talk about state legislators. State, efforts are very, very difficult to control at the federal level. He wants to end the federal level profiteering off incarceration and put the so-called Obama-Biden administration's policy to end the use of private prisons at the federal level, rescinded by the Trump administration. It wants to, include diversion programs, commercial bail, electronic monitoring, et cetera. And he'll support the passage of legislation to crack down on the practice of private companies charging incarcerated individuals. Well, at least he's realistic here that he wants to support it. He's looking for somebody else to lead it, apparently, otherwise he'd just say it. And I'm not exactly sure how that's going to happen. I'm glad that he's got it in here, but again, where's the detail? Provide the unique needs of incarcerated women. Receipt of federal criminal justice grants and adequate provision of primary care for women, including the care for pregnant women. That's good. That's smart. He's got a way to get it done. It will likely create some change. I don't know how far and how deep, because he's not particularly clear. Time will tell, I suppose. Right. So next, wants to ensure humane prison conditions. He will call for an overhaul of inhumane prison practices. He'll end solitary confinement, except very limited exceptions.
Interesting.
And he'll require states to fix environmental health problems in prisons. Those things taken together will not ensure humane prison conditions. It will improve the humaneness of prison conditions in some places. That's what it'll do. So it's overpromising and a bit unrealistic. No citations here.
Yeah, because to ensure you'd have to have inspectors, and then consequences for not following the rules and things like that. So,
well, and how does he expect the states to pay for improving inhumane conditions, which in many cases are driven by very poor facility conditions in the first place? There are prisons in this country that were built, around the Civil War, and they're still in use. And they don't have enough space for programming, and they've got antiquated policies and procedures, and they overuse, solitary confinement and more isolated punitive measures in the prison system. So it's much deeper than what he, writes here. And then he ends the entire section on the adult system by smartly encouraging states to collect sufficient data. And here, look at the word. He wants to encourage states. Okay, well, it's good, more realistic. And then he's got some data, some citations about what states are doing or not doing. And he says simply, the administration will encourage states to add information regarding ethnicity to their criminal justice data collection. That's it.
Only ethnicity?
Right. What? I guess. I don't know. It just seems like, on the one hand, he manages to overpromise, but in the same paragraph, then underpromises. So it's a little confusing to me. I think that this is a man who doesn't quite know what he believes on this stuff and how it's particularly different from what he used to believe. I think more than, for whatever reason, more than some of the other candidates. He's just a pure, plain, simple politician.
He's just taking stabs in the dark here, sort of. Yeah. I don't know.
Then he gets into a whole range of issues on the juvenile justice system, and he wants to develop and implement policies. Interesting wording here, whoever wrote this, in this space, in the juvenile justice space, based upon input from children and young adults who interacted with the system as children. All right. Well, it's a good source of input. I think probably need more input than that, so I'm not quite sure. It doesn't seem to be worded quite right. He wants to invest $1 billion per year in juvenile justice reform. It makes me wonder, that $20 billion he was talking about there, that's not apparently not on an annual basis. Is it over the term of his presidency or what? But here, it's $1 billion a year. He wants to provide children with better legal representation. And states that take funds will have to fulfill requirements about expungement and sealing records of juveniles. He talks about what Congress has already done that costs us $176 million a year originally, but appropriated only $60 million, and he wants to up that to $1 billion. Well, I'd like to get a deeper dive into what all that money has done to date. And then again,
is going to do more.
Yeah, it's the federal government's got limited capabilities, but we've got some history here. We could figure out whether or not the stuff works very well. He can cut the population of incarcerated youth by supporting community-based alternatives to incarceration, like mentorship, counseling, and jobs. This doesn't mean ankle bracelets. It means in-person support for our kids. He's got a new grant program to encourage states to place nonviolent youth in community-based alternatives. All right, well, if you're only going to place nonviolent youth in these places, you're already not going to get there. A lot of these kids are there because they've done a violent act. Right. And he's already
written them off as unhelpable.
He goes from stopping the incarceration of kids to, I mean just nonviolent. Right. And then listen to this. He wants to repurpose empty prisons for the community's benefits so they cannot be used in the future for detention. $100 million pilot program to change the use of empty prisons. So
how many empty prisons do we have?
Repurpose. We got a lot of them. A lot of them. In Michigan alone, we've got over 20, because we closed 20, and we tried to repurpose them. We couldn't repurpose them. Nobody's particularly interested. It's really hard to repurpose a prison. There's limited use of what you're going to do with a bunch of double cells. And it's really expensive to do that. I think we sold one small prison facility to a local sheriff for $1. And I think that they ended up turning that into a detention facility, very limited purposes. And I had an idea that we played around with and never did in the Granholm administration here in Michigan to have a national contest with architectural schools to see what they could do to kind of get at this. Cool idea. He's got a link here on this repurposing, so I could dig in a little bit deeper on that and see how he wants to do it. It seems a bit out of place here. I don't know. $100 million is an awful lot of money to change facilities. Wants to expand funding for after-school programs, et cetera. Increase the federal investment for those, and wants to end the use of detention as a punishment for certain status offenses like truancy, alcohol use, and curfew. see how he's going to do that. Biden will add to juvenile justice grant programs a requirement that states eliminate detention as punishment for status offenses. So you don't get the certain kinds of federal money unless you do it. So what federal money does he want to attack? How does he want to attach it? Is it enough to make it happen? How are states going to do it? Is he want to pay for some of that with $1 billion a year? I mean, it's vague.
Yes.
It's a smart thing, but we're not just looking at smart values here. We're looking at, are they clear about how they're going to do it? He wants to double the number of health professionals in schools to help. He doesn't say he wants to reduce the school-to-prison pipeline. He says he wants to end it. And how's he going to do that? He wants to provide guidance to help schools address the high number of suspensions and expulsions. Well, that can reduce it, not a bad thing, but it isn't going to end it. So once again, it's this thing about the opening says they're going to end it, and then you read the paragraph, it says, oh, well, you're not really going to end it.
Yeah, he does this.
You're going to reduce it
quite a bit. He comes off really strong if you only read the bold bullet points. And it's just like, well, I'm going to try to do that, Say, okay.
And then he redundantly goes back to expungement and sealing of juvenile records. Then he moves, he went from adult system to the juvenile system, and now he's going to second chances, which we'll see here, whether it's for both adults and juveniles. Biden believes in redemption. They should have the opportunity to fully integrate into society, earn a good living, okay? That's also our best strategy, reduce recidivism. Set a national goal of ensuring 100% of formerly incarcerated individuals have housing upon reentry. 100%.
Again, goal means it's something to shoot for, but obviously, we want. If you're in favor of having housing upon reentry, obviously 100% is your ultimate goal, but a more realistic goal of saying 60 or 80 or something like that. Not to once you get there say, okay, we're done with this problem, but to
and then at the end of the section. He'll start by directing the Department of Housing and Urban Development to only contract with entities that are open to housing individuals looking for a second chance. Well, that's a good start, and I don't know what it'll do. They can be open to it without necessarily doing it very much. I mean, why don't we get at some numbers here? But the number of the housing opportunities that he'll open up is nowhere near the number of housing opportunities that are needed. And he wants to expand funding for transitional housing, which has been cut. So there's a couple things he'll start. All right, so why don't you add another sentence in there about how you're going to finish it? And this is the juxtaposition that we haven't seen in the other two candidates. Bernie overpromised and never backed off and never gave hardly any details except for some executive orders about how he would do things. Warren parsed her stuff very carefully. I think it was a bit better written of the three in terms of what she can do and what she can't do. But Biden here is setting the bar high and then immediately setting it low.
Right.
And he's done that here. He gets back into expanding health care, substance abuse treatment, and repeats some of the other stuff. It is redundant. He wants to eliminate barriers for folks returning from prison. He'll direct his cabinet to pursue a comprehensive review to identify these barriers. Well, they've already been identified ad nauseum. Then he'll work to eliminate these barriers through executive action when authorized and through legislation. All right. And then he gets into some examples of the stuff. But once again, it's not eliminating these barriers. That's not going to do it. Closing out here, he talks about reducing violence and supporting survivors of violence. He wants to pursue evidence-based measures to root out persistent violent crime. Good, wants to pursue it. He will counter the rise of hate crimes.
Okay.
He wants to prioritize this. That's more realistic and not overpromising. He wants to reinvigorate community-oriented policing. Talks about the COPS program, which hasn't been funded. And he wants to fund it with $300 million. And the question is, all right, why hasn't it been funded in the past? Why has it been blocked? How is it going to be different now? You're going from senator to president in a Republican Senate. So, of course, he was vice president in that space of time. But he wants to establish a panel, to scrutinize equipment that's being used, right? It's kind of vague stuff. He wants to defeat the National Rifle Association again.
Because they were defeated once?
I've seen what he says here. In the months ahead, he'll detail his plan to tackle the public health epidemic of gun violence, starting with universal background checks and bans on assault weapons.
Biden has defeated the National Rifle Association on the national stage twice before. As president, he will defeat the NRA.
Why doesn't he? I don't know what he's talking about. Why doesn't he link to that? When and what? Defeated them? I don't know. I'm not sure here. Reduce violence against women. He wants to here he parts it, work to reauthorize and continue to strengthen the act. He'll put forward a detailed plan in the months ahead. Well, it's been months ahead, and this hasn't been updated, so...
He does throw in that powerful clause as the original author of the Violence Against Women Act. Biden will. You get some points for that.
Yeah. Well, and this is good stuff that he's doing here. He doesn't link to the act, which he should do. And this couple of times here, he's promised to put more details forward. We'll have to take a look at those when they come out. And then wants to support survivors of violence, communities experience of violence, and first responders. He wants to fund a demonstration project to help with non-traditional approaches to healing trauma. That's good. It's a good start. He'll direct U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to do a comprehensive review. Okay, and then presumably he'll act on those. He doesn't say that, but I guess you can assume that. And then he wants to work to raise the funding cap for Victims of Crime Act programs and provide more financial support. Well, okay, it's good that he wants to do this stuff. You put together the three things that he wants to do, and it's true that will increase support, and it's true that it will have an impact. This particular place here, he doesn't overpromise.
Right.
He's promising more realistically, and he could do better, I think, by looking at the way this is developed here and applying that to some of the other bullets. So that's about it for him. Much briefer than the others.
I learned in middle school that when you're writing a document, you got to give your introduction, a little bit about your thesis, and then talk about what you want to talk about, and then give a conclusion where you wrap things up. And he's just sort of left us off at this last bullet point and hasn't tried to tie anything together at the end here.
Yeah. I think this is. I put this out of the three that we've looked at, third in line, for all the reasons we discussed. So let's look ahead. Where you want to go next? We've got Kamala Harris. We got Cory Booker. We look at either one of those, or anybody else you want.
I think Harris is the one that I'm most intrigued by, given her prosecutorial background.
Yeah, well, and she's in fourth place in most polls, a distant fourth. So let's take a look at hers next.
Okay.
Always good to talk to you.
Talk to you next week. Thank you for listening. If you like what you've just heard, you can support us by telling a friend or sharing us on social media. All of our episodes can be found on our website, seekjustice.fm. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we can be reached at seekjusticefm@gmail.com or via our Twitter account @seekjusticefm. See you next week.